How's everybody doing today? Happy Friday. We're still waiting for some folks to join up. We only have 11 people watching right now, so we'll wait until we have some more. well. So it's 7:41. I'm going to get started because there's things that I have to talk about today. So let's hop to it. I just wanted to let you guys know I added some more to the PowerPoint on Canvas. So if you go on to Canvas and download from the files section, there's a folder in there that says lecture PowerPoints. The one that's in there is the updated one. And there's some content that I'll be talking about throughout today's lecture from that PowerPoint. So make sure that you download that so you have the most updated version, excuse me. And let me get this situated here. All right. Let me All right, we got 21 people watching. That's definitely not the whole class, but I guess we'll just go with what we got. And let's get started and continue talking about the Russian Revolution. I'm going to pop this over to my desktop now so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to scroll this back up to pick it up where we left off. This is not the right one. I got to open this one. And then, okay. So we talked about that. We talked about Rasputin, the holy man. We talked about this. We'll put this over here so I can see how many folks are in here. And then, okay. And then we talked about how Nicholas II lost control. So, all right, so let's just pick it up. Let me just kind of reintroduce you to what we've been talking about. We talked about the Russian Revolution of 1917. And remember that the Russian Revolution, it's two revolutions for the price of one. One half of the revolution starts in March, which, remember, because the Russian calendar was kind of behind the rest of Europe, it's sometimes called the February Revolution of 1917 or the March Revolution of 1917. But either one it's referring to the same thing. It's just that calendar confusion we talked about last class. And then there's one in October/November of 1917. And so just, you're going to want to make sure that you remember that aspect of the Russian Revolution, that you're really talking about kind of two revolutions in one. So what happens in each of those? The February/March Revolution 1917, that was the one where there's widespread strikes, workers are revolting, soldiers are revolting, the commanders aren't listening to Nicholas II anymore, and he is forced to step down from the throne. So that's the one that happens in February and March. But in between March and October, Vladimir Lenin is not yet quite in power. The original government that takes over in Russia during the revolution is the Duma, that provisional government that had been established years back but never really listened to by the Tsar. And so the Duma was supposed to be a provisional or temporary government until they found a more permanent solution to how the Russian state would be governed. But before they were able to draft a new constitution for Russia or whatever they intended to do, people are still really, really, really upset, particularly the peasants. And yeah, so it's a protest, but it's like a big protest. And when it's a big protest, that's a revolt. And so the workers, I will tell you this, the big difference between the Russian Revolution and, well, there's many differences between the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, but if you remember learning about the French Revolution last semester, you'll probably remember that the French Revolution was largely led by the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, the students of the Enlightenment who were trying to reduce the power of the nobility, the clergy, and the King of France. Unlike France, the Russian Revolution is largely very commoner-driven. During the French Revolution, most of the commoners were peasants who lived out in the far countryside. But the Russian Revolution, because of the beginnings of industrialization in Russia, this made it so that far more regular, everyday common folk were the ones that were the most riotous and upset with the Tsar, because it was the soldiers, the lower class, working class soldiers who had been the victims of so many casualties in World War I. The working class lived and worked in miserable conditions. There were a lot of really backwards policies that made their life extremely oppressed. And so it's very much more so a commoner-driven revolt, a revolt that alleges to be in favor of the commoners, because communism, of course, appeals to the working class because they want to improve their lives and be equal and stuff like that. And so the Duma takes control for about 6 months in 1917, from March until October. And during this 6-7 month time span, people remain extremely upset. And they're upset because, frankly, there's so many problems in Russia that the Duma doesn't really know how to. Russia's never experimented with any other kind of government for the past 300 years other than absolutism. They have no experience with democratic government, with parliamentary government and those kinds of things. And so the Duma is going to be pretty hopelessly ill-equipped to handle the various problems that Russia is facing. The other side of it is that Russia is still, at this point in 1917, involved in World War I. And the Duma, more or less, refused to get out of the war. And when they refuse to get out of the war, this causes more and more and more discontent. Meanwhile, while the Duma is in charge under the leadership of a guy by the name of Alexander Kerensky, Vladimir Lenin, on the other hand, is telling people, if it was me in charge, if we led a communist revolution and the Bolsheviks took power, the Bolsheviks promise you peace, land, and bread. And that was you had that term in your vocab assignment for today, the April Theses. These were the promises that Vladimir Lenin made to the commoners of Russia in April of 1917 about the aims and goals of the communist revolution. So anyhow, so that's the March Revolution, right? When the Tsar steps down, and we talked about the April Theses. Nicholas steps down from the throne, and 3 centuries of Tsarist rule of the Romanov dynasty, or Romanov dynasty as it's sometimes pronounced, finally collapsed. And about a year later, their entire family was murdered, and we talked about that last class as well. Someone needed to rule Russia. That was the Duma, headed by Alexander Kerensky, what we were just talking about right now. They continued fighting World War I. This was a bad idea because it ended up losing them support from the commoners and from the soldiers. Meanwhile, angry peasants were demanding land. City Vladimir Lenin, yes. Vladimir Lenin came like a long time before Vladimir Putin did, yes. Vladimir Putin only came to power when I was in about high school. That was maybe, I think he came to power in about the year 1998 or 2000 is the first time that I really remember hearing about Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin he's a different sort of a cat. You know, he is a former KGB agent. He's like a black belt in judo or something like that. But he is very similar to a lot of Russian strongmen who end up taking power in Russia and refusing to give it up. And so Vladimir Putin has been very clever since the start of the 21st century in finding ways of being able to retain power at the top of the political system of Russia. Okay, so the angry peasants are demanding land. City workers grew more radical, and those Soviets, those worker councils. What is a KGB agent? Oh, okay. So think of the KGB as being basically the Soviet Union's equivalent to the CIA. It's kind of a secret police organization. The KGB, though, were more likely to use, they use espionage like spying and stuff like that to gain information, but the KGB also will perform like assassinations and things like that. It's more or less a secret police agency. But before the KGB was called the KGB, it was actually referred to as the Cheka, C-H-E-K-A. The Cheka was the original secret police of the Bolsheviks, and that may come up on the test. We'll talk about that later. So these, Jacob, yes, is there a way to turn in late work or something because my computer froze when I clicked turn in, so I had to turn it off and now my file's gone. Okay, send it to me in a message on Canvas and tell me which assignment it is. So, which I know it's the vocab one, but just tell me anyway. Okay, so these Soviets, remember, are workers' councils, okay, groups of workers these Soviets started popping up all over Russia, local city councils consisting of workers, peasants, and soldiers. And because those people make up the majority of the population of Russia, we start to see the Soviets, basically posing their own political challenge to the Duma, the provisional government. The Soviets increasingly start to have more and more and more influence. Yes, but the FBI, Venkata, is it's domestic. So the FBI looks internally at investigations within the United States. The CIA is more international. And the KGB is also, the KGB is kind of both domestic and international. So, yeah. Anyhow, so these Soviets, these workers' councils, start to pose a serious threat to the stability of the provisional government, the Duma, during 1917, after the Tsar has already stepped down from power. And the political party that these workers, soldiers, and peasants belonged to was the Bolsheviks. Yes, Venkata, yes. Okay, the Bolshevik Party, headed by Vladimir Lenin. German military leaders took Lenin, and they knew that Lenin was a revolutionary figure. Believe it or not, as the Germans are fighting against Russia, they look to Vladimir Lenin as a viable way to incite internal chaos in Russia. Make no mistake, Germany doesn't care about the future of Russia. They could care less about the future of Russia. They want to stop fighting Russia in World War I so that they can take the military troops that they're using in Eastern Germany and move them over to the Western Front so that they can fight against the British and the French. So the Germans basically take Vladimir Lenin, they put him into a sealed railroad boxcar, okay, and they take him and they basically inject Vladimir Lenin directly into this hostile situation in Russia, knowing that if they can get Vladimir Lenin into Russia and have him start working within Russia to incite a full-scale revolution, that Russia will more or less be forced to get out of the war. And remember that Vladimir Lenin had already promised the people that if he came to power, if the Bolshevik Party took over, that peace would be one of their goals. So, German military leaders shipped Lenin to Russia from Switzerland, where he had been living in exile by way of railway, to create disorder within Russia. And he surely does that. So, the Bolsheviks, the way that they are able to gain support is by making promises to the people about the things that they are most upset about: peace, land, and bread. So Lenin revitalized those slogans from the Mad Mother's March to influence the Tsar to step down, okay? And he reinvigorates that slogan, peace, land, and bread, as a way of demonstrating that if the Bolsheviks came to power, they would immediately address the needs of the commoners, of the workers, of the soldiers, of the peasants, okay? So in October, November, again, yeah, it's docked 20%, so you can still get 80% on it, okay? All right, if it's late, just send it to me in a message in Canvas, and I'll make sure to add it. All right, so peace, land, and bread. 1917, October/November. Armed workers took control of government offices, and Alexander Kerensky's leadership in the Duma came to a complete end in the face of the new revolution of October, where now Vladimir Lenin comes to power and overthrows the government. So here's Vladimir Lenin in the background, revolutionary figure in Russia, supported those communist ideas of Karl Marx, and we talked about how Lenin's older brother was arrested and hanged for plotting to assassinate the Tsar, and Lenin had been in exile. And remember that one of the big differences about Lenin and Marx is that, in contrast to Marx, Lenin viewed the working class as unable to organize proper revolutions or create effective political actions without strong leadership. And that's why he takes control of the Bolshevik Party, to organize and to be able to plan and harness the power of the people, I guess. Okay, he felt that the proletariat, the working class, remember that's that fancy word proletariat just means working class, required the leadership of an organized and disciplined political party, the Bolshevik Party, that would start the revolution and create a communist society in Russia. So Lenin, when he comes to power, transfers legal authority to the Soviets and is opposed to World War I. And the first thing that he does after the what's called the storming of the Winter Palace. The storming of the Winter Palace was that bloodless revolt that took the Duma, led by Alexander Kerensky, out of power. And he changes the name of the Bolshevik, he changes the name of Russia, of the country of Russia, to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, okay? Soviet Union, as it's sometimes called, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And you can see that word Soviet in there. Why Soviet? Because remember that Lenin transferred political authority to those local working man's councils called Soviets. Now, of course, when he comes to power, those Soviets end up not having the same leverage as they did before, because if they dissented with the party, the Soviets are controlled by the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks are controlled by Vladimir Lenin. So when these Soviets come to power, there is no room for dissent anymore. What Vladimir Lenin says goes. And so the Soviets are bound to one-party rule and are completely loyal to Vladimir Lenin because he's the leader of the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party. And of course, when he comes to power, he makes himself the head of the cabinet, which was known as the Council of People's Commissars. And so this cabinet of political figures that was running the government from the top down, he's the very head of it at the top. And here are some images of Vladimir Lenin. And so Lenin headed the Bolshevik Party, which was, remember, they were the most radical communist supporters of Vladimir Lenin. And the way that they were able to come to power, just to remind you, is that they used World War I, Russia's hungry population, and the inequalities of workers to gain support. They made promises to people in areas where they were most upset. And that's a real easy way to see the rise of totalitarian dictators. We're going to talk as we go throughout our class today a bit more about the rise of communists and fascist leaders. Now, we will have a more formal unit on this coming up next unit when we talk about the interwar years and the rise of totalitarianism, but I'm going to give you a brief preview of some of these ideas today in class. But it's a classic textbook move to prey upon the vulnerabilities of the people, make promises to them about those vulnerabilities, and then get them on your side and take over power. And the second that these guys take over power, of course, the promises that they made go out the window, and they become kind of drunk on this power that they have accrued. And so, in Russia, you've got kind of a variety of, this is, one second, let me reduce the size of this here. Here we go. Okay, this is kind of hard to see. Let me fix this. Okay, so this is the political spectrum of people in Russia at this time. As you can see, on the far left, sometimes we use the term far left to describe radicalism. Why left? Well, leftists are usually the ones that want to institute the most amount of change, the most radical changes, okay? But to be fair, there is such a thing also in global politics. Uh-oh. Are you guys still there? I kind of lost my connection for a second there. You guys still here? I lost my connection for a minute, it said. Okay, cool. All right, let me get back to this. So what I was saying is that when we use the term far left, okay, when we use the term far left, we're usually describing people who want the most change, the most radical changes, okay? However, it is true that you can also have extremism, radicalism on the far right as well, okay? But in Russia at this time, the far right in Russia would have been the ones that were on the side of the Tsar, the people who wanted to see the Tsar restored to power. Because usually when we describe left radicalism, let me just take a minute to describe this here, okay? Let me type this in. Far left radicals typically want the most change, okay? And then I'll change the color here to blue. Well, I'll change it in a second. Far right conservatives typically want to defend tradition and the status quo. Keep things the same. Let me put this in blue. Boom. Okay, so, and I'm just using colors here as, you know, for no real good reason, but I'm using red for the far left because red is the color that is typically politically associated with communism, right? You know, if we think about, if somebody says, uh-oh, red flag, right? Uh-oh, red flag. That's usually like a warning sign, right? When we hear the phrase red flag, like, uh-oh. But where the term kind of comes from, actually, is communism, because most communist nations actually have red flags. The Soviet Union had a red flag. China has a red flag. Vietnam, when it turned to communism, has a red flag, etc. So these kinds of things kind of translate to modern day phrases. But anyway, point being, far left radicals typically want the most changed. Far right conservatives typically want to defend tradition and the status quo. In other words, they want the least change. They want to keep things the same. And so in Russia at this time, if we're taking a look at the total political spectrum, because Russia's made up of a bunch of different people with a bunch of different opinions. Some of them, a lot of them, because so many people were working class folks or peasants in Russia, many of them are going to be radical Bolsheviks because their lives have gotten so miserable, they want to see the most change. You also had the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks, remember, were still leftist. They still wanted to see some change, but they didn't want to see the most radical changes implemented. You also have people who were in the middle, moderates, who, you know, they may not have loved the Tsar, but they're kind of concerned about if Russia was to go down the path of communism. You kind of have the conservative class of folks in Russia who want to keep the system more or less the same at that time. And we might say that a lot of those folks would have come from the bourgeoisie in Russia at that time, because the bourgeois class in Russia had been doing pretty well. So because they're already doing pretty well and their lives are not that miserable, they don't want to see that many changes made, right? And then you have the people who would have remained loyal to Nicholas II, the nobles, the clergy, the people at the very top of the political hierarchy during the age of absolutism in Russia when Tsar Nicholas II was in power. They'd like to see Russia go back to absolutism, to put Nicholas II back on the throne and continue moving the way that Russia had been moving for the last 3 centuries. So this gives you an idea of the kind of the political spectrum and how we get those terms far left and far right. Sometimes here today, we still hear those terms used to describe the American political climate, right? You have people who are on the far left who want to see the most radical changes implemented in America, and then you have people who are on the far right who want to see kind of the radical opposite of that happen. But I think if we're being fair, most people in America are probably somewhere in the middle. I think America is really divided right now, but you know, maybe, and this is maybe a bit optimistic, but I'd like to believe that most Americans are pretty, at the end of the day, pretty sensible people who want to see stability, and they don't want to see major upheaval and chaos and change in any form from either side, from either the left or the right. Most people, I think, are pretty content with, like, you know what, we'll make moderate changes when we need to, and we'll keep other things the same, and let's just kind of keep the system going the way that it's going, because it seems to be working out pretty well for most people. So, anyhow, moving forward. So, talking a little bit more about this October Revolution that that brought Vladimir Lenin to power. This building in the background, actually this photograph in the background, was from the Winter Palace storming. And remember, it's a non-violent revolution. It's a bloodless coup. When Vladimir Lenin shows up and takes over the Duma at the Winter Palace, no one dies. It's not like the storming the Bastille back in the French Revolution, where they were cutting people's heads off and parading around the city and stuff like that. It was a peaceful coup because the Duma had already really kind of lost the support of the common people, because the common people were all Bolsheviks who supported Vladimir Lenin. So no one was sad to see, at first, very few people, especially the Bolsheviks, were very sad to see, not very sad to see the Duma dissolved. However, immediately after the Duma is dissolved, this provisional government, the Bolsheviks end up engaging in a civil war with anyone who opposes their successful takeover of the government. And that's where things get real scary in Russia, right? Is because the minute you have a revolutionary takeover of the government, if there's people who resist that takeover, and then there's a war, that's a civil war. That's going to cause tremendous amounts of loss and chaos and so on. So the second that Vladimir Lenin comes to power, he comes through on one of those three promises. Peace, land, and bread. One of the first things that he does is he starts negotiating with Germany to get Russia to drop out of World War I. But Germany is not going to let Russia just drop out without getting anything in return. All right? So the Bolsheviks ended Russia's involvement in World War I by signing a treaty. And the name of that treaty is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was signed on March 3rd of 1918, just about 5 months after the Bolshevik takeover of the government. And so, Vladimir Lenin negotiates with the Germans. That same year, remember that the Romanov dynasty family was executed, okay? And so the royal family is murdered in 1918, and they do that to prevent anyone from trying to challenge the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks and their opponents, the Mensheviks, end up fighting a civil war from 1918 to 1920, because remember, the Mensheviks didn't want to see Vladimir Lenin completely take over the country and create a dictatorship. Lenin, the capital of Russia previously had been St. Petersburg, but Lenin moves the capital to Moscow. So St. Petersburg, the previous capital, the new capital is now Moscow, and he initiated what became known as the Red Terror against the White Army. Okay, so the Russian Civil War was between the Red Army versus the White Army, and the White Army was the Mensheviks and any other political dissidents who didn't believe in Bolshevik takeover, and the Red Army were the Bolsheviks. And the Red Army was, basically led by Vladimir Lenin's best friend, Leon Trotsky. So Leon Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army, and they were very diehard Marxist communists. Okay, so what happens during this Red Terror? Well, the Russian secret police, and I'm just going to put this word in here right now. At this time, okay? The Russian secret police are known as the Cheka, okay, the Cheka. And the Russian secret police ended up killing 200,000 of Lenin's opponents. I want you to consider that for a second. 200,000 people. That is a huge, huge number of people. And so it becomes very clear from the start, okay, very, very clear from the start that that Vladimir Lenin is taking no prisoners. He is going to be a ruthless leader who uses terror, who uses murder, who uses spying and propaganda and so on to consolidate his power. Melania Trump is from Russia, okay? Yes. Okay, in July of 1918, that was when the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas II and his family to prevent them from being manipulated by the White Army or from coming in. All right, so here's the Romanov dynasty. In case you were wondering what they looked like, this is Tsar Nicholas II right here. Here's his wife, Alexandra, who ended up becoming very, very close with Grigory Rasputin, you'll remember. Rasputin wrote her a letter shortly before he was assassinated saying that he feared for his life and that if he was killed by commoners, the royal family would be okay. But if he was killed by nobles, which he was, then he feared that the entire Romanov family would not live longer than 2 years. And the thing that's kind of creepy about that is, remember that Grigory Rasputin claimed to be this like mystic holy man, this magical figure, right? And so he thought for sure that he had these mystical abilities, but then he actually makes this prediction not only about his own life, but also about the lives of the Romanov family, and they end up becoming true. So that's kind of a weird, it may just be coincidence, but nonetheless it is kind of freaky. So there's Alexandra. The eldest, he had 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. And Anastasia was the one that for a while people thought there was a chance that she may have gotten away. But I believe forensic investigations conducted about 20 years ago finally put that rumor to rest. And then his only son, Alexei, the child who Grigory Rasputin allegedly healed with his mystical abilities, because remember that Alexei had that blood disorder called hemophilia. On a completely unrelated note, for those of you that are hockey fans, no one will probably know who this guy is. This is a goalie that used to play for the Anaheim Ducks. His name was Jean-Sébastien Giguère. He's still around, but he doesn't play hockey anymore. But I always thought that Jean-Sébastien Giguère, who was the goalie who won the Stanley Cup with the Ducks back in 2007, bears a striking resemblance to Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. So that has nothing to do with anything. It's just kind of an interesting, like, weird coincidence. Okay, so when the Russian Civil War breaks out, Britain, France, Japan, and the U.S. all sent troops and supplies to aid the White Army. Okay, so the White Army was receiving the Mensheviks, the people who are fighting against the Bolsheviks, are getting all of this aid from foreign nations. But unfortunately, the White Army just wasn't able to, they didn't use the resources and advantages that they had to their full potential. The other side of it is that the Bolsheviks, excuse me, I apologize for that. I hiccuped in the middle of my sentence there. The Bolsheviks ended up just being so radical that the only way to win a civil war is to get enough people on the other side, okay? I'm not really phrasing this the right way. The White Army had a real obstacle because of how, I hate to use the word brainwash, but that's the only word that I can think to use. It's not really the word that I want to use, but the Bolsheviks were really very uniform. Okay, they were very uniform, and Vladimir Lenin's leadership was very, very good, and he was very good also at manipulating the people in the Bolshevik Party. And because of this, it made the Red Army quite a difficult force to go against, because these people are so radical and so extreme and also so uniform. They're diehards, right? They are absolute diehards. And Vladimir Lenin has this massive, massive group of people in Russia wrapped right around his little finger. So even though the White Army had these advantages, where foreign powers were helping them out with military supplies and other things like that, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough, because the ideological extremism of the Bolsheviks was just it was basically insurmountable. And so this civil war in Russia wages on for 2 long and very, very, very deadly years. I want to just point something out to you guys, okay? Russia, remember, had been fighting in World War I 1914, 1915, 1916, and all the way through 1917. The minute that they get out of World War I at the start of 1918, okay, a civil war breaks out in Russia. Now, at the time that the civil war breaks out, Russia had already lost upwards of 5 million people in World War I, okay? That's a tremendous number of people, either by way of casualties on the battlefield, disease, you name it, okay? When the Civil War breaks out in 1918, not only have they already lost all of those people fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War I, now that they're out of World War I, they start this civil war, so now they're fighting against other countrymen from Russia, and another 10 million people are estimated to have died, not all of them in battle, some of them through disease, some of them through starvation, some of them through other means, but the point, execution and so on. But another 10 million people lost between 1918, 1919, and 1920. So basically Russia, from 1914 to 1920, loses somewhere in the area of 15 million people. That number is almost hard to wrap our heads around. And I want you to consider just for a moment, 1918 is about 50 years after our own Civil War here in the United States. We fought our Civil War from 1861 to 1865, all right? In our Civil War, which was, by the way, our Civil War was the deadliest conflict, the deadliest war that America has ever been involved in, okay? It surprises people because you would think that America would have lost more men in World War II because, number one, it's more recent. Number two, the weapons were so much more deadly. But remember that America enters into World War II a little late, just like they did in World War I. And so if we look at the total number of people killed from America in World War II, It's about 300,000 people. That's the total amount. In our Civil War, okay, the Civil War, 1861 to 65, where the North was fighting against the South, we lost about 900,000 people, maybe a little more, okay? Just under 1 million. And that, to this day, is the deadliest war that... Okay, are you guys with me here? You able to see what's going on? Okay. Cool. Sorry about that. The internet connection here is a little bad today. The point being, guys, that let me just finish up the point that I was trying to make, which is that Russia, in their civil war from 1918 to 1920, lost 10 times the number of people that we lost in our civil war, fought 50 or so years earlier, okay? And our civil war also lasted twice as long. So we are talking about huge, huge numbers of losses in Russia, and that is going to have a long-term effect on Russia. Communism. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks began this rather disorganized plan called War Communism. And when you do your next vocab assignment, which will be due for next Tuesday, okay, I'll be putting that up after class today. When you do your next vocab assignment, you're going to see War Communism on there. Let me take a minute to explain to you what War Communism was. Remember that in order to understand War Communism, we first have to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what communism is. So going back to some of the things, just to remind you of what I taught you last week, remember that the goal of communism is to try to create the goal of communism is to try to create an equal state where everybody is equal, all of the social classes are dissolved, okay? The government runs everything. That's the goal of communism, to try to create a perfectly equal society and a utopian perfect society, okay? Those are the goals of communism. So, one of the first things that happens when a communist government takes over is that the government, oh my gosh, this is frustrating. Where is my, I really don't know what's happening with the internet here, folks, but one of the goals is that when the government takes over, you lose your rights in the name of equality. Bingo. That's exactly right, Arnav. Nice job. Okay? But also another thing that happens, okay, another thing that happens is that the government goes around and gobbles up all private companies, all private lands, and they make them property of the government, okay? This is what, we have a name for this, actually, and in here. Collectivization, okay? Collectivization, okay? Collectivization is when, think about it this way. The root word being collect, the government is going around and collecting all of the private property and making it the property of the government. That's what collectivization means, okay? And when the government does this, here's the problem with that, okay? Here's the problem with that. Remember that this is the first time that a communist revolution has ever taken place in history, is the Russian Revolution, okay? Marx had said that if the government took control over everything, it would create this nice, perfect society. The problem was that the government isn't as good at running private companies as those private companies are. So let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, that there was a bunch of private companies, like let's say there was a bunch of shoe companies, just to use something simple, okay? Nike, Adidas, Reebok, whatever, okay? There's all these shoe companies, and the government turns into a communist government and then collects or gobbles up all of those private companies and says, hey, you're no longer in charge, we're in charge now. This is now a government shoe facility, okay? The problem is that the government doesn't know how to run that shoe factory as well as the private people who owned it did. And so when the government takes over all of these lands, takes over all of these private companies, and they start putting government administrators in charge of these companies, okay, these companies start being less productive because the people in charge, they're paper pushers, they're government politician people, they're party officials and stuff like that. And they basically say, we're running the show now. The problem is that they don't know how to run the show as efficiently. And so these companies and farms and lands in Russia, when war communism is put into place, they don't know how to manage all of it at once, and it creates actually it's an absolute economic disaster. The whole plan just blows up right in Vladimir Lenin's face, because within 2 years of war communism, where they go around and take all the land, take control of the banks, take control of all of the industries, take control of all private commercial property, outlaw private trade. When they do all of this, of course, the economy absolutely crashes. All right? Let me show you some of the effects of war communism here. In just about a year and a half of fighting, in 1.5 years, industrial production due to war communism had fallen by 90%. Because again, the government becomes so overburdened by trying to micromanage all of these different factories, all of these different farmlands, all of these different institutions like banks and so on and so forth, that they just don't have the resources to do it. And they all fall flat on their face. Agricultural output. Remember, one of the promises that Vladimir Lenin made was peace, land, and bread. He was trying to fix the agricultural problem, not make it worse. And so agricultural output goes down by half. They were already starving before Vladimir Lenin came to power. And his war communism plan makes the entire situation basically 10 times worse. And he very quickly realizes, holy smokes, I've got a major, major problem on my hand, because now the workers start to strike against him by 1920. Even though they're coming out rather victorious in the war against the White Army, the Civil War, okay? So, former soldiers, after the war comes to an end. Previously, the soldiers were always run by the government, so they didn't have a problem managing the soldiers because the military was always government run. However, when the war comes to an end, now those soldiers are coming back to Moscow, coming back to St. Petersburg, or returning to their little farm, and things aren't the same anymore. And there's no jobs available. The unemployment rate skyrocketed. There's too many workers and not enough jobs for them. Hey, thanks a lot, Arnav. I feel very refreshed because it's Friday. I'm just happy that it's Friday. I'm going to make some music today, which I'm super excited about. And yeah, it's just a good day. Good day to talk about the Russian Revolution. So, former soldiers flood the workplace, peasants start rebelling, workers are going on strike. Vladimir Lenin is like, uh-oh, I have to do something. Okay, I have to do something. So Lenin realizes he needed to win the support of the workers back. And so what he does is he radically reverses his war communism plan by creating a brand new plan called the NEP, the New Economic Policy. And he introduced this plan in 1921. Okay, he introduced this plan in 1921. And really what this plan did is he realized, oh my gosh, you know, the government is just completely ill-equipped to deal with all of these private industries and stuff like that. Now, some of the hardline communists in his party are not happy with this. They want to see the government stay in control of all of these things. But Lenin, not being a stupid man, realizes, hey, if we don't make some changes, we're not going to have a political party anymore. We're going to have a brand new revolution on our hands. And so he introduces this new economic policy, the NEP, in 1921. But as I've told you before, economies are really hard to turn around. Think of them like those giant ocean barges. Once they're moving in a certain direction, to slow them down and then turn them around and start moving them in the other direction takes time, and it takes a whole lot of energy. So even though he introduces this new economic policy in 1921, it could potentially take years to reverse the devastating effects of his disastrous war communism plan. In the short term, it does temporarily restore some elements of capitalism and some private enterprise. He realizes, like, oh my gosh, you can't just flip a switch and immediately turn a government straight to communism, okay? Because the whole economy will fall flat. So you have to have some private industry, you have to have some capitalism, you have to have some freedom in your economy. But here's the tragedy of it, is that before the new economic policy has a chance to even work, Lenin dies. Vladimir Lenin dies in 1924, right about the same time that the new economic policy was finally starting to, if you will, right the ship from, correct it from capsizing and completely sinking, okay? And so Lenin dies in 1924 before it really has a full chance to work. And immediately when Vladimir Lenin dies, remember, he's been the inspiration for the Bolsheviks for 20 years, going all the way back to Bloody Sunday in 1905, okay? Even when he was living in exile, the Bolsheviks still, relied upon the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, and now he's dead. And when he dies, there's this huge power vacuum. And immediately, all of the top-ranking Bolsheviks, communists, in the political party start competing. There's a power vacuum, and they start competing for who is going to take over. Now, if Vladimir Lenin could have hand-chosen somebody to take the reins of the Bolshevik party, he no doubt would have chosen one of his best friends and leader of the Red Army, Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was probably even more of a strict Marxist than Vladimir Lenin was. And so Vladimir Lenin trusted Leon Trotsky, and he would have probably put him in charge. But Vladimir Lenin dies rather suddenly, and I think he's only in his mid to late 40s when he dies. He's not a very old man. And so it kind of creates chaos for a few years, and immediately this guy by the name of Joseph Stalin, okay, who we will hear much more about throughout the rest of the school year, Joseph Stalin starts using terror and oppression to start murdering anyone who would be a viable competitor to him taking over the party, including, believe it or not, Leon Trotsky. So here's what happens is Leon Trotsky gets exiled to Mexico by Joseph Stalin, and when Leon Trotsky, basically the second that Leon Trotsky steps off the boat in Mexico, he is promptly murdered by a bunch of dissidents using pitchforks and other things like that. So Leon Trotsky who would have been Lenin's hand-picked successor, gets killed, assassinated essentially, by Joseph Stalin. Not personally. Joseph Stalin isn't the one that personally murders him, but he no doubt had a role in setting up Leon Trotsky to be murdered. And so that was a major blow to what would have been Lenin's legacy. To be honest with you, Vladimir Lenin knew Joseph Stalin, and if you look through your textbook, you'll find a point. There's a passage in your textbook somewhere where Lenin says something about Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Lenin basically says, I really am worried about Joseph Stalin because he has all of the makings of a tyrant, and he's a dangerous man. Okay, here's the thing about Joseph Stalin. Some people in the world are what we call sociopaths. And what a sociopath is someone who essentially lacks a conscience. They don't feel remorse. They don't feel guilt. They don't feel pity. And so they are very ruthless people. And they're also they can be at least, very, very manipulative people. And Joseph Stalin is a full-blown sociopath. I'll give you a little bit of a story to characterize what I mean by that. Joseph Stalin ends up taking sole control over the entire Communist Party and the entire Soviet Union, the entire country, by 1928, 4 years after Lenin's death. He stays in charge. So he starts leading Russia in 1928. He does not give up his power until he dies in 1953. And so that means he's the leader of the Soviet Union all the way through the 1930s, 1940s, which includes World War II, and into the 1950s. And during World War II, Joseph Stalin's son got captured by the Nazis. And a high-ranking Nazi official called up Joseph Stalin in Russia, and they're like, hey, we have your son. If you want him back, you'll have to do da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And Joseph Stalin says, well, if you captured him, he must not be a very good soldier, so you can keep him. Of his own son. Okay, I want you to consider that for a second, right? This is how ruthless this dude was. To basically hear that your son has been captured by Nazi high command and is being tortured, and basically say, well, probably means he's no good, and then just hang up, click, okay? It takes a pretty heartless individual to do that. And so that's the kind of guy Joseph Stalin is. He is tough as a nail and has absolutely no pity. An unusual story about Vladimir Lenin. This image here is not a model. That is actually Vladimir Lenin's embalmed body. Because Vladimir Lenin was seen as a hero of the Russian Revolution, kind of on the same level as, like, let's say, a Maximilian Robespierre, although not really, but kind of more like a Napoleonic type figure in a way. In France, that's the only equivalent that I can really. They're very different, to be honest, but whatever. I'm just trying to draw an equivalent here. But anyway, the point being that instead of burying him, what the Russian government decides to do is to embalm his body, to preserve it. And they put Vladimir Lenin on display, and indeed, if I'm not mistaken, he is still on display today. They have to every so often kind of touch him up a bit, but anyhow, so that is kind of an unusual story, but that's the truth. I don't know what else to tell you. All right. So Lenin dies in 1924. There's this struggle for power, particularly between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, as I told you about. Leon Trotsky was this talented party organizer. He had created the Red Army and led the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as led the Red Army in the Russian Civil War. He was a very strict Marxist. He was very close friends with Vladimir Lenin, and he gets exiled and murdered in Mexico, as I mentioned to you. Joseph Stalin was known as the general secretary of the party. He ends up becoming the leader of the Communist Party, and he claimed to want socialism for Russia. He talked a good game, but ultimately really didn't want that, and ends up really his sole goal. He's not a strict Marxist. His sole goal is creating a communist dictatorship in Russia, in the Soviet Union, as it's called now at this time, and so anyhow. That's kind of the he's more interested in glorifying his own power and control than he is anything else. And here you can see what I mean by that. Stalin in control, and I apologize that these are kind of off center here. Let me see if I can really quickly. So the first thing Vladimir Lenin does, the first thing that Joseph Stalin does when he comes to power is he puts an end to Lenin's NEP. He stops Lenin's NEP, which, remember, had not had yet a full chance to operate and get Russia's economy back on track. So Joseph Stalin, you've probably seen him before. This is what he looks like in the background there. He returns the Soviet Union to what's known as a full-blown communist command economy. Okay? A command economy is the kind of economy that communist governments have. What does it mean? It means that the government is in control of absolutely everything. All factors of production, land, labor, and capital, those three fancy words that we learned back in the Industrial Revolution unit, land, labor, and capital are all controlled by the government. That's what a command economy is. Here's Joseph Stalin when he was a young man. As you can see, he's a rather dapper-looking young man. All right, he, had kind of a Johnny Depp kind of look vibe to him a little bit, and then there he is, older in his older years, towards the end of his life. All right, I heard somewhere that Stalin died of a stroke because his doctors were so terrified of him that none of them helped him. I've never heard that story before, Brendan, but I guess I would believe it, because Joseph Stalin was a guy who could make you disappear overnight, okay? When I say that Joseph Stalin ruled with an iron fist, what I mean by that is he had absolutely no tolerance whatsoever for people questioning him, okay? He was, it was his way or the gulag or whatever. And that's one of the ways that Joseph Stalin retains power is he uses these prison camps, basically concentration camps known as gulags, okay? But instead of like the Nazis with their concentration camps, they were putting like minorities into the concentration camps, like Jewish folks and gypsies, mentally and physically disabled folks and stuff like that. Instead of that, Stalin was putting just Russian people into these gulags where they would be living out in Siberia chopping down trees all day long, and they'd live there the rest of their lives and die from being worked to death. Okay, so that was the future of a whole lot of people. If you were even if you were just suspected of being a threat to Joseph Stalin, you would be gone. You'd wake up one day, your neighbor steps out to pick up the paper. Hey, where did Bill go? Oh, he doesn't live here anymore. Oh, okay. And then you wouldn't have even asked any questions, because that could mean that you'd be shipped off next. So this is the kind of fear and terror and oppression that Joseph Stalin uses to retain power in Russia at this time. And folks, that will bring me to the end of my lecture for today. So I just want to say thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you all have just an absolutely wonderful Friday. I am going to be putting a new vocab assignment for you up for the weekend. Please remember that those are always due at 8 a.m. It would really help me out if you could hand those things on time, because it's frustrating to have to be dealing with late assignments. Be a student, do what you need to do, okay? Get things done on time. And I don't want to have to be, and Neil, I'm looking in your direction, and various others who have messaged me about late work and stuff like that. Please, please, please be diligent, okay, and get your stuff done on time, because it's important. I know, Gareth, but vocab is important, because if you can understand the words and how they fit together and stuff, you become more literate. Venkata, yes, it is due on Tuesday morning, okay? Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Have it turned in by then. If you're worried that you're not going to hand it in on time, hand it in the day before, okay? Hand it in now, whatever, okay? Just make sure that it's handed in, because it makes my job a lot easier when it comes to entering grades into the grade book, which I'll be doing today, and updating grades and stuff like that. So, folks, have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you back on Tuesday morning, and as always, make good decisions.